Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me from his home in Arlington, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C., is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you?
I am hugely terrific, and in fact, I can still say I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested, an awesome son of Mother Africa.
Well, you've never shied away from being called the awesome son of Mother Africa. I like that.
Thank you.
Since we are talking about Mother Africa, your fellow compatriot or fellow countryman, Dominic Ongwen, was recently convicted by the International Criminal Court. He's a very unfortunate guy, one of the very few people who have actually been convicted by the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, he was convicted, and I guess the real person that needs to be right in that place, the man that should be one of the first people to really get that kind of treatment, should be Joseph Kony himself. But where is Kony?
Kony is still at large. You can imagine the Ugandan government poured in a lot of resources. I remember in 2012, I was part of this campaign by Invisible Children, where they managed to lobby the whole world and raise so much money. Even the United States sent in troops into Central African Republic to get Kony, and up to date, we've never seen Kony or heard about Kony's whereabouts.
You know, I think it is good, of course, that Ongwen was convicted for those types of crimes. Because when you think about crimes against humanity, when you think about those heinous crimes which are responsible for, first of all, for killing a lot of people and for also taking away people's dignity, those people need, sincerely, some kind of justice. The problem is there are some critics who say that, when we talk about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which of course was founded by the Rome Statute, which came into place in the early 2000s, they say that it is not really providing the sort of justice that they expected it to provide. That what seems to be doing is like some other earlier political courts that in fact have dispensed what they characterize as victor's justice. Victor's justice in the sense that they basically go for the small fish. They go for the kind of, for example, political rebels who are referred to them by the governments, which are very, very democratically challenged, which in fact do not try their own soldiers who, critics allege, commit equally those types of crimes against humanity.
Shaka, you just brought up a very good example. You talked about the victor's justice. Some critics have suggested that, for example, the International Tribunal for Rwanda, the International Tribunal for Liberia, a lot of critics have said that these courts were set up for the victors, people who occupy power, have literally gotten out with murder. The only people who have been tried by these courts are people who, in a way, could not afford even to represent themselves, or later on were leaders of those rebel movements that we are talking about, who killed a lot of people. But at the same time, the governments that recommended these people to be tried there are equally guilty.
I think that when you look at some of the people that have actually been charged, it is obvious that these are the sort of people who do not have powerful friends in the right places. And when I'm talking about the right places, I'm talking, for example, about the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. I am also talking about, the fact that these are not government types. The people who belong to the government who have allegedly also committed equally the same crimes have gotten away with it. You remember that at one time, the UN Security Council, after the case of the then president of the Republic of Sudan, Marshal Omar al-Bashir, that case was referred to the International Criminal Court for the crimes that he allegedly committed in Darfur. But guess what? He has never appeared in The Hague. Even after he has been overthrown from power, he has yet to actually go and become a subject of due process, so that the people that he allegedly may have been responsible for killing, or his government has been responsible for killing, receive at least some sort of justice. We only have an example of a former African president, Professor Laurent Gbagbo, from the Ivory Coast, who also the courts found there was no incontrovertible evidence to support that type of case against him, and the man was acquitted.
Those are very interesting examples, and to your point, I could not agree more with your analysis. But there are also those who said that even in those cases that you've pointed out, for example, the issue of Bashir in Sudan, the issue of Laurent Gbagbo in the Ivory Coast, they were really political targets. These are people, a lot of people have argued that there was never going to be evidence even for Bashir to be tried there, because at the time when his crimes happened, he was in control of all the security apparatus. Therefore, they could have gotten rid of the evidence. But to Bagbo's point, a lot of people say he didn't even deserve to be there. It was just a political thing that happened to him. His main rival, Alassane Ouattara, thought by keeping Gbagbo around would be a problem, so he decided to recommend him to the ICC to be tried by the ICC.
In addition to the point that you just made, there are other critics, in fact, who sort of corroborate your view by adding that in addition to Alassane Ouattara himself, Alassane Ouattara's government was very, very strongly supported by, of course, a European superpower, the Republic of France. By the way, happens to be one of those key countries that, in fact, provide the strategic funding that allows the International Criminal Court to do its business.
Let's go back to Dominic Ongwen. A lot of people say he was a victim who turned, I guess, a gross violator of human rights. Initially, this guy was abducted by Joseph Kony, and he grew, when he was a very young boy, he grew through the ranks, rose through the ranks to get to the point where he was a commander. But a lot of people, even people who gave testimony at the court, in a way suggested that this guy was more of a victim than the actual perpetuator of those crimes.
Yeah, in fact, I have seen the same evidence. You could quite clearly put him in those two different boxes. And as a matter of fact, his lawyers say that they are definitely going to appeal the case. And they are optimistic that if the higher court will look and examine some of the evidence that they claim to have, that he may very well, in fact, be acquitted.
And there is a likelihood that he might, because when you look at the likes of Thomas Lubanga, the Congolese warlord who was acquitted, who was convicted, then appealed, then acquitted by a superior court, there is some precedent there.
But when you look at that particular case, of course, involving the Ugandan rebel group, the Lord's Resistance Army, these guys were actually not fighting alone. These guys were, in fact, in a war theater. And they were, in fact, fighting or interacting with members of the Ugandan National Army, the Uganda People's Army. And there are some people who are wondering why, for example, the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the gentleman from Argentina, why he was never able to charge beyond the Lord's Resistance Army members who only happened to be part of the picture.
When you look at the case of Uganda, the Ugandan government referred the case of Joseph Kony, the likes of the Dominic Ongwen, to the ICC in 2004. They focused on crimes against humanity committed by the Lord Resistance Army, but there are those who argue that the troops, the Ugandan troops, equally committed some grievous crimes in northern Uganda, because Joseph Kony and his team were not just fighting among themselves; they were fighting against these heavily armed forces that literally swept everything that came their way.
Indeed, that is the reason why earlier I also said that I have actually come across critics who have been very, very strongly making that same point, wondering, in fact, how come, yes, you do have some members of the Lord's Resistance Army who have actually been charged with crimes by the Hague-based ICC, but what about the other part of the picture? Some elements within the Uganda People's Defense Forces. Some of the people, some of the individual senior military officers who may in fact have been in command of some troops which may equally have committed exactly the same crimes. That is why, earlier, as you said, there is a general understanding that, frankly, so far, the types of people that have been tried and have been charged and found guilty, they are largely people who reflect the type of guys that do not have power, that do not have friends in positions of influence globally. So in order for the ICC to be seen as dispensing justice rather than victors' justice, it needs to go beyond the type of people that they have actually been charging and convicting. They need to go for some bigger fish.
And who are the bigger fish? Are you referring to the people who basically provide the money? When I've watched a lot of these uh, criminal gangs or operations in the Americas, the drug cartels, when they are going after guys, they go after the guys who provide the money, the people behind the money, because those are the guys in position of power. Those are the guys who usually control the means of violence. In the case of these countries that have referred certain groups of people to the ICC, none of them has been touched. Are you perhaps suggesting that the ICC should look even closely at some of those guys who provide the resources, some of those guys who are in charge of the states when it comes to dealing with or dispensing justice at the ICC?
Unfortunately, Paul, when you look at the mandate of the International Criminal Court, it specifically talks about individuals, specific individuals who have committed specific crimes. It does not necessarily uh, talk about the people who, for example, are behind in terms of being responsible politically for making the policies, for making the decisions and deploying the troops. It talks about individual commanders who commit those crimes in the process of discharging their duties on the ground.
Uh, Most recently, since we are on Uganda, there was a case that a lot of people thought would get attention. There was a massacre that was carried out by the Ugandan troops in the western part of Uganda, a district called Kasese, where the government troops raided one of the palaces and literally killed a lot of people. To this day, the International Criminal Court did not even want to entertain the idea of looking into that case. The guys who allegedly committed the crimes have have since been promoted to even senior ranks in the military. Isn't that ironic that they're able to do that and get away with it?
That is most unfortunate, Ndugu Paul. And that is part of the reason why some critics allege that you are talking about a court that does not sincerely dispense justice as it were, but that it dispenses selective justice, meaning that you are in fact looking at a sort of international court that is equally in the business of dispensing what they call, not me, but they call victor's justice. Because when you think about the situation that you elaborated, you very well talked about regarding Kasese, it has to be the Ugandan government, for example, that has to refer that particular case to the international community. To what extent would you honestly expect the Ugandan government to refer its own commanders to The Hague for being prosecuted? Unless, of course, there was another path, meaning unless you had a situation that was referred to the International Criminal Court by the UN Security Council, I don't see really how that is going to be possible. I think that it's quite possible that those types of people that you are talking about will basically get away with the murder. Because you know, the International Criminal Court, by the way, is not, from what I understand, a primary court. It is rather a court that is complementary. You go to that court when you are not capable, for example, of internally having a judicial system that can first and foremost try those types of crimes locally. That is only when the International Criminal Court will come into play. That's part of the problem. It's very tricky. And therefore, one could say very highly political, really.
Would it be fair to say that a lot of critics, or would you agree with a lot of critics who have said that the International Criminal Court, by its nature, is very biased against Africans?
You know, there is a perception that that is the case. And when it comes to perception, in politics, perception tends to be reality. But the truth, to be very honest with you, is that a lot of these African countries that are part of the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court and which came into force in the early 2000s, a lot of these African countries are actually founding signatories, like Uganda. General Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa happens to be one of the Rome Statute signatories. And when you look at the DRC, you look at some of these countries that eventually referred some of those cases that they could not possibly deal with using the local judicial infrastructure. Those cases were voluntarily referred to the ICC by those governments. They were not under any gun, they were, these are people who referred cases to the ICC clearly knowing that those people were going to be, obviously, to be charged by International Criminal Court. Those people, when you talk again, it's a question of the state. In order for the ICC to work, it first and foremost requires the cooperation of the state, of the government that refers those cases to their headquarters. Without the cooperation of the state, of the governments, you cannot, the ICC can only do so much, really. Look at the case of Kenya, for example, the controversial case of Kenya. The controversial case of Kenya could not go forward precisely because the Republic of Kenya could not adequately cooperate with the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court, and what is very interesting, that particular case had actually been referred to the International Criminal Court by the Kenyan government. But beyond referring the case, the Kenyan government could not provide the necessary evidence so that those individuals could be charged. And those people who had been referred to the Hague included the President of the Republic, Uhuru Kenyatta, and his deputy, William Ruto, and others. But it collapsed. It collapsed partly because the African Union decided to make it a political issue. And in fact, the African Union was largely supported by some of the African leaders, some might call them rulers, who were themselves founding signatories of the Rome Statute. And the cases collapsed.
Out of all the cases that are currently being handled by the International Court, it's surprising to note that just 3 countries are non-African. And we are looking at Afghanistan, Bangladesh / Myanmar, and Georgia. The rest of the countries are African. You look at Uganda, you look at Burundi, Rwanda, Central African Republic, Mali, the Ivory Coast, just to name but a few. Most of these cases are all African. So that's why I earlier on said that there seems to be some kind of bias. I don't know what kind of bias it is, but there could be some truth to the fact that they want to go after Africans.
I think it is a perception. First of all, I said earlier at the outset that in order for a case to be referred to the ICC, it has to be the type of case that cannot be dealt with by the local judiciary system. A lot of these countries have judiciary systems that provide adequate judicial or legal or prosecution types of services. So sometimes that is part of the reason they are able to circumvent not going to the Hague. On the other hand, they do have political clout. In fact, there are some critics who wonder why, for example, Britain's former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and the US former president, George W. Bush, were not. Why their cases were, for example, not referred to the ICC for having invaded what critics say an illegal invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s. There are people who actually wonder why those two very powerful individuals were not able to be charged by the International Criminal Court.
Despite a lot of criticism for the International Criminal Court, there are people who think it's still the best thing that could have happened to the world. Is that true?
I think that everything being equal and everything being relative, it's quite possible that in certain circumstances, it may probably provide some reasonable options. But I think that in order for it to command respect, in order for it to essentially, in order for people to retain confidence in its abilities, in its capabilities of dispensing what they consider to be justice, it needs to be a little bit more perfect.
How about the issue of perception? A lot of people say that the International Criminal Court is biased. How can the International Criminal Court maybe work towards clearing that perception?
I think the perceptions are always going to be there, especially given the manner in which you come up with certain decisions that end up affecting, people. But I think that when you think about the perception that the court targets unfairly Africa, you can probably find that there is no strong evidence to make that kind of point, really. Because the last time I checked, Paul, who is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court?
Fatou Bensouda from the Gambia.
And where is Gambia? Where is the Gambia?
In Africa.
There you are. So are we suggesting, for example, that, Madam, are we suggesting, for example, when we agree with the perception that the ICC unfairly essentially focuses on Africa vis-a-vis the other parts of the world, that perhaps Madame Bensouda, even herself, may in fact be socially, culturally, and politically insensitive to the people from whom she comes from?
Well, it could be possible. The people who argue that some people can become more Catholic than the Pope.
That is true, but I think really what is needed, Ndugu Paul, is to come up with incontrovertible evidence. If you can bring facts, you can bring data and evidence that points to that allegation, then you are on the right track. But if it is merely perception that reflects certain specific ideologies or reflects some kind of opinion, I think then you have a problem. Because we are operating in a world where it should be understood that whereas everybody has a right to own their own opinions, they do not have a right to own their different sets of facts.
Well, Shaka, thank you so much for your time.
You're most welcome, Ndugu.